My name is Greg Hunter. Welcome to part 1 of the 30 Years' War. These talks are about the history of the wars, with emphasis on discerning the actual war aims. These talks are not about whether the wars were morally justified. However, feel free to discuss your moral judgments. I will be proposing a framework for understanding the actual aims of these wars. And I will be interested in your opinion on how well you think this framework can account for the history. Here is one framework that has been proposed: a mission from God. Let's look elsewhere. Here's another proposed war aim.
And I talked about my desire to promote institutional change in parts of the world, like Iraq, where there's a free press and free religion, and I told him that a lot of people in our country, would hope that Russia would do the same thing. I fully understand, however, that there will be a Russian-style democracy.
We certainly would not want to have the same kind of democracy as they have in Iraq, I will tell you quite honestly.
Just wait.
In the meantime, let's look elsewhere.
The United States military has launched dozens of Tomahawk missiles on sites in Syria.
The missiles hit the Syrian airfield where that horrific chemical attack was launched that killed more than 80 civilians.
No child of God should ever suffer.
It was this image of a grief-stricken father holding his two dead twins that affected Trump more than any other.
Setting aside President Trump's personal compassion, for which of the wars in the last 30 years has humanitarianism been invoked? Yes, of course, all of them. Are there any that are still considered to be humanitarian interventions? I will be presenting evidence that humanitarianism was not a cause for any of them. Bear with me until then while I look elsewhere. Were Iraq's weapons of mass destruction an imminent national security threat? Would you agree no? They were illusions conjured up in the interests of wealth and power. More to that later. Has idealism played a significant role in the new Cold War? Idealism. The international system can be lawful. All states can and should act to enhance global cooperation, universal justice, peace, human rights, and international law, which is often traced to the treaty that ended the first 30 Years' War and the principle of Westphalian sovereignty. That is, non-interference in other states and the right of self-determination.
For unlike the great powers of old, we have not sought world domination. Our union was founded in resistance to oppression. We do not seek to occupy other nations. We will not claim another nation's resources.
If idealism was not a war aim, then perhaps realism. The basic tenets of realism are: the international system is anarchic, international law, that is, as it is actually practiced, is a reflection of power. For example,
this law, which enjoyed broad bipartisan support, authorizes the President to use all means necessary and appropriate, including force, to shield our service members and the armed forces of our allies from ICC prosecution.
All states act to expand their power.
The United States, like other great powers, does not pursue humanitarian objectives. It pursues objectives determined by power considerations.
Economic interests and geostrategic interests. Thucydides famously summarized realism as: justice, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Realism postulates that all states would seek regional and global hegemony if they could. Here are 4 realist doctrines in U.S. foreign policy. This quote from Thucydides was about what war? Yes, the Peloponnesian War. What was that about? Regional hegemony between Athens and Sparta, which means military as well as economic and trade dominance. What is the only country in modern times to become a regional hegemon? And what is the doctrine that affirms that hegemony? The Monroe Doctrine. Thucydides' quote was warning Milos that they must be subservient. And for the same reason, Theodore Roosevelt said the U.S. must carry a big stick. The USA's longest war for regional hegemony was the Indian Wars. They have also fought Britain, Spain, Mexico, Japan, the USSR, as well as attacking with troops, proxy forces, or economic and political warfare most countries in the Americas. The most costly war for regional hegemony in terms of U.S. lives was against the Confederacy. Their current Milos is Venezuela. And if Venezuela is Milos, there are 2 Spartas gaining influence there, Russia and China. Or to use another analogy depicted in this cartoon, in 1898 the U.S. was able to stop Britain's aggression against Venezuela. Now, however, will the U.S. be able to stop Russia and China's cooperation with Venezuela? For centuries, what was Britain's European strategy? To balance against any potential European hegemon and peer competitors in North America, Africa, and Asia, and to become a global hegemon. The U.S. is also an offshore balancer. What doctrine have these men promoted that has been U.S. policy for 70 years? The containment of Russia and China, as stated in the Truman Doctrine. Truman couched his doctrine in the idealistic terms of supporting free people against tyranny, yet the first application was in Greece, where he supported the fascists, and then in Korea, where he supported the brutal dictator Syngman Rhee. Spykman's map shows the main, but not exclusive, battles of containment to be in the Rimland. Let's have a closer look. What potential hegemon lies in the heartland? Has the U.S. fought any wars of containment in the Rimland? How would you update this map from 1942? Is there another potential hegemon? Yes, of course. The U.S. had not yet lost China.
The norm is we rule everything, and if someone else tries to control their own area, that's disruptive of the international system.
Since the Clinton years, U.S. Pentagon planning has included the words full spectrum dominance. You might say Mahan in 1890 had the same idea. What military power did he promote? Sea power. The need for Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the U.S. to contain Russia and China, and for U.S. control of the sea, sea lanes, and choke points. It appears he missed the step of containing Germany and Japan, but he was correct about the importance of U.S. naval power through history and today. Why was Alsace-Lorraine coveted? To control its energy resources. Acquiring energy resources enhances a country's latent power, and restricting other nations' access to energy increases one's own relative power. What energy-rich area has been under continuous attack in the new Cold War? The Persian Gulf. Whose doctrine specifically stated its importance for U.S. national security? The Carter Doctrine. The United States would use military force, if necessary, to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf. No matter the specific geopolitical policy, what economic policy does the U.S. always pursue? Neoliberal economics, which means privatization, austerity, and hollowing out of state programs. Does this seem overwhelming? You may surprise yourself. I would bet you can already apply these 5 realist doctrines. Can you name one of the doctrines you see that is involved in the following news headline? Department of Justice confirms largest ever U.S. seizure of Iranian fuel on 4 ships bound for Venezuela. Did I win my bet? Bonus marks if you said all of them. The Monroe Doctrine, regional hegemony of the Western Hemisphere. The Truman Doctrine, containing allies to Russia and China and control of the Rimland. Mahan, control of the seas. The Carter Doctrine, control of energy in the Persian Gulf. And the ubiquitous neoliberal economics and dollar hegemony. Now, could Iran seize U.S. ships? Thucydides has a quote to explain why not. Justice, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. We will see how each of the new Cold Wars fits into several or all of these realist doctrines. Realism is a major aim in the new Cold War, but not the only aim. Here is a more complete framework of how actual war aims are formed in practice. I call it practical realism. Is the international system lawful or anarchic? Would you agree semi-anarchic? International law is a reflection of power.
The U.S. Did add a reservation to the Genocide Convention when it signed it finally, saying we're immune.
There is another important factor that influences how realism is practiced. What do you think it is? The elites of all states act to enhance their self-interests. Their moral, economic, political, geostrategic, ideological self-interests. I left in moral interest just in case we should find any. Are the elites interested in pursuing idealism or realism? I will let one of the power elites speak for all.
I'm interested in Libya if we take the oil. If we don't take the oil, no interest.
As with morality, idealism plays a minimal, if any, role. Here's a quote written specifically about Eisenhower's order to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, but meant to apply to international relations in general. A quote that should have a prominent place in every social studies classroom. As we have argued, the norms of private life and of a polity regulated by law are only with difficulty invoked in global politics. Here's another quote by a realist academic who was an advisor to Reagan and Bush I. The pronouncements of the policy elites are heavily flavored with moralism. Behind closed doors, however, the elites who make national security policy speak mostly the language of power, not that of principle. And the United States acts in the international system according to the dictates of realist logic. What do you think? Does this seem like a strong framework to explain the new Cold War? First, let's see if you can apply it to some historical conflicts. Is there a self-interest that motivates these men's foreign policy opinions? Here's what an Iraq veteran and former history instructor at West Point thinks.
Potential 7-figure salaries upon leaving the military through the revolving door to the defense industry. So
Economic self-interest. Is their opinion aligned with idealism or realism? Realism, of course. And with what form of macroeconomic policy? Neoliberalism. When Reagan's mistakes in Lebanon resulted in the deaths of over 200 Marines, what military action did he take at the cost of 19 more U.S. lives? He invaded Grenada, an island in the Caribbean.
Those who were killed, wounded, or injured in this operation, I believe, are heroes of freedom. They not only rescued our own citizens, but they saved the people of Grenada from repression and laid aside a potential threat to all the people of the Caribbean. After viewing the massive hoard of Soviet weapons found in that island, who knows what evil the liberation of Grenada achieved for us.
Well now, to use his words, what evil self-interest did this invasion achieve for Reagan? Political. Did his self-interest align with idealism or realism? Realism. But were his professed aims heavily flavored with moralism? What about the Grenada government that makes an obvious connection to neoliberalism as a goal? They were a socialist government. Colin Powell's former chief of staff, Colonel Wilkerson, emphasizes to his students the influence of politics on foreign policy.
National security decision-making is what it's called. One of the influences I emphasize is domestic politics.
When Canada sends peacekeepers, for example to Congo in the 60s, are the professed geostrategic aims idealist or realist? What about our actual motives? This is Prime Minister Lumumba after his arrest and taken to an airport controlled by UN peacekeepers. Notice white newsreel photographers and white pilots on hand. This is Canadian Prime Minister Diefenbaker. This is our top UN commander in Congo, Colonel Burrill. Yves Engler relates how Colonel Burrill described his actions in a Department of Defense interview.
And the Canadian colonel told Mobutu where Lumumba was, told Mobutu that he should dispatch a flight to capture Lumumba. There was a Canadian military officer put on that flight. They capture Lumumba. A couple weeks later, he's dead, and then his body dissolved in acid.
Were Canada's actions aligned with idealism or realism? This book is an academic study of our Congo mission. In it, you will not find one government document aligned with idealism, except some lower-level civil servants who surreptitiously went against government policy and transferred some resources to fight famine in the Congo. What realist U.S. doctrines was Canada aligned with? The Monroe Doctrine? How? It would not do for Canada to oppose the regional hegemon. Truman Doctrine? How? To oppose Soviet interests in Congo, and in particular to hold NATO together, whose commander was a Belgian, threatening to resign if the U.S. did not accede to overthrowing Lumumba. Neoliberal economics? How? The interests of Western private mining corporations and financial institutions. When the weak challenge the strong, whether Congo or Milos, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. George H.W. Bush fought Gulf War I against Iraq inside Kuwait. Clinton fought a bombing and sanctions war against Iraq. George W. Bush followed similar realist logic, but in ways influenced by the ideology of his administration. Retired General Wesley Clark describes a visit to the Pentagon a few weeks after 9/11.
And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do."
And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, "Oh, sir," he says, "it's worse than that." He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, "I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office. It says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran." I said, 7 countries in 5 years. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us.
What is the ideology of those hard-nosed people called? Neoconservatism. What is that ideology, and how did it influence U.S. war aims? More to that later. Thesis. The 30 Years' War is based on the calculations of practical realism. That is, realism refracted by elite self-interest. Does this seem to you to be a plausible framework? I will be interested to hear your opinion on how well it holds up to the evidence. Before we look closely at George H.W. Bush's wars, here's a challenge. Can you see how any of these 5 realist doctrines might have had something to do with these wars? Okay, ready for the answer key? Please mark yourself. Dissolution of the USSR? An easy one, containment of the USSR. Neoliberalism versus communism. Panama invasion, regional hegemony. Choke point, Panama Canal. Containment of the USSR. The USSR was on the ropes. No one could tell the global hegemon what to do. Haitian coup, regional hegemony. Choke point. The windward passage between Haiti and Guantanamo Bay is the main sea lane between the Atlantic and the Panama Canal. Neoliberalism versus state social programs. President Aristide had gone rogue, training doctors and nurses, building hospitals and schools, raising the minimum wage, raising mineral royalties, not privatizing industries. Where's the profit in that? Iraq, of course, controlling the Persian Gulf. Choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. Containment of the USSR. Who wants to waste a unipolar world? Or, as George Bush called it, the New World Order. We'll now look more closely at each war and see if practical realism, that is realism influenced by the self-interests of the elite, can account for the war aims. Or if we have to invoke other factors such as idealism, humanitarian intervention, democracy promotion, or divine inspiration. Operation Just Cause, Panama Invasion, 1989. Were George H.W. Bush's stated aims the actual aims? Combating drug trafficking? Can you name this man? If you have read about CIA complicity in the global drug trade, or specifically how CIA proxy forces, the Contras, were funded by cocaine trafficking to fight the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, or the John Kerry Senate Committee's tactful conclusion, senior U.S. policymakers were not immune to the idea that drug money was a perfect solution to the Contras' funding problems, Or if you had listened to this former head of the Drug Enforcement Agency,
a ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America.
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.
That knowledge might have you wondering if the invasion was a war on drugs or a drug war. What is known for certain is that Noriega had been on the CIA payroll helping the Contras by trafficking arms and drugs.
Working with the CIA and with Israeli arms dealers, Noriega helped coordinate an arms supply network to provide weapons to Contra bases in northern Costa Rica.
It is by now undeniable that the same planes that were carrying arms from Panama into Costa Rica were also carrying drugs.
But in 1989, Noriega had become independent and was supporting the Escapulas Nicaraguan peace agreement that would leave the leftist Sandinistas in power in Nicaragua. Like many Latin American dictators, Noriega had been trained at the Pentagon School of the Americas. Perhaps as a cautionary tale for aspiring dictators who might attempt to become independent, the school should have included Thucydides' Malian dialogue on its required reading list.
If they kill an American Marine, that's real bad. And if they threaten and brutalize the wife of an American citizen, sexually threatening the lieutenant's wife while kicking him in the groin over and over again, this president is going to do something about it.
I think, was to create an international incident, was to have United States troops just hassle the Panamanian people until an incident resulted. And from that incident, the United States could then say that they were going into Panama for the protection of American life, which is in fact exactly what happened.
The United States tonight declared in effect that Panama's General Manuel Noriega is a threat to this country's national security.
The idea, at least on the American side, was to lead these coup plotters along, to seduce them into believing that they had the support of the United States, and then at a critical moment abandon them, so that then the excuse could be made that we had to smash the PDF completely, that we couldn't rely anymore on disgruntled officers inside the Panamanian army to rise up against Noriega, and we would have to do this job ourselves.
They focused on Noriega to the exclusion of what was happening to the Panamanian people, to the exclusion of the bodies in the street, to the exclusion of the number dead.
The truth of the matter is that we don't even know how many Panamanians we have killed.
Panama is another example of destroying a country to save it. The United States has exercised a might makes right doctrine among the smaller countries of the Third World to invade these countries, get what we want, and leave the people that live there to kind of rot.